today's is special because I'm going to be talking about something I never really discuss in depth, and that is aesthetics, specifically about board game storage. Now, before I really get started, I would like to invite you, if you haven't already, take a look at all my various social media pages and my Patreon, where you can go see and do all sorts of cool stuff along with me. Now, getting right into the discussion for today, there were four major things that I wanted to talk about with regard to board game storage. First thing is just the general aesthetic aspect. How do things look? The second thing is making sure that you can find the games that you want. The second thing, or the third thing, is to make sure that you can access the games, where just because you know where they are doesn't mean that they're not buried somewhere. And last but certainly not least, I wanted to talk about how it helps the games themselves, and then I wanted to discuss a little bit about how things change when you change storage. And as always, of course, I want to hear what you guys have to say. What are your storage solutions? Do you care about how the games look? All that kind of stuff. And at the very, very end, I will discuss just really briefly some of the cons for doing things. Now, I'm sure you guys have all noticed over the last few weeks and months, I have been upgrading my shelving units. I used to have the big, giant utility shelves, and now I have upgraded to the Kallax, which is a very common board game storage solution, essentially. And I'm really excited about it, right? So the first thing I wanted to discuss is the aesthetics. Those utility shelves, they were black, they were perfectly fine, but they're more at home in a garage than they are in a game room. So this is just a little bit of a cleaner look. It's kind of nice. You got the nice sharp corners and all that kind of stuff, and it just looks a little bit better. It looks almost like a library, essentially, for games, which is really, really fun and I really appreciate. Second thing, making sure that games can be found. So after I got my final shelf, I essentially spent a day-ish, a good few hours, making all of my games put into alphabetic order. So behind the camera here, we start with A, and then going around and around and around, bam, we end with XCOM, essentially, as the last one that I have down in that corner. So that means that anybody can find pretty much any game because they're all alphabetized, which, it took time, it took a decent amount of work on my part, but it's really well worth it. So next thing is accessibility. Previously, my shelves were about 6 feet tall, so they were just a touch taller than me, and I had games stacked almost all the way to the ceiling in this room, which is about 8 feet. And the problem is that meant I could barely reach the top. Much less having all of the games stacked on top of one another meant it was really, really difficult to get specific games out. So now it's much easier because now we've got, just this nice sort of bookshelf system where you can just take them out as you see fit, whichever ones you need to get, you just take it and drag it. Now, obviously that means that sometimes the pieces are shuffling around, but not a big deal, which leads me right into my next point of how this treats the games differently. So obviously storing games vertically depends on the game as to exactly how good or bad it is, but in general, it's not really a huge deal. You get pieces shuffling around, sometimes mixed around, but for most games, it doesn't really affect them too much. Most importantly, though, is previously when I had my utility shelves, while I did have liners on the shelves, on the ends of the width, I guess, or the depth rather, essentially they were like this, and on either end on this side, there were the thicker bars, and some of the games were big enough that they would overhang the edges. So whenever I had games on top of them, then they would get pressed down. And so some of my game boxes have little indents from those bars. And now having this where they're not holding up anything else is tremendously helpful. Even the ones on the top that are still stacked up, they're at least just stacked on top of one another, and I've got the biggest games on the bottom, and they are on a flat surface rather than some kind of weird barred surface, essentially. So that brings me to sort of the last thing I wanted to mention, which is essentially what ended up happening with all of my storage. So now, again, I can't fit all of my games on this side of the room. A lot of them are on the other side behind the camera. And that's sort of the trade-off that you have to play, because since I can't stack them all the way to the ceiling anymore, that means they have to go somewhere, right? But at the same time, I really don't mind that. I think that it's okay, and I think it's worth it to have a better presentation. I think it's nice because this way, whenever I host game nights, it's a lot easier for people to find them. It's not... it's still pretty intimidating to see a giant wall of shelves, but pretty much anybody can reach anything, which is really nice and very helpful. And you don't have to strain your neck trying to look at the top of my shelves anymore, which is always very nice. But again, that's sort of just my take on it. I think it's good to have this, but And the other thing is that you have sort of the price of prettiness. Again, I need more space, which is unfortunate, but I don't mind it too much. The other big issue that I ended up having with it, with the alphabetizing, is the fact that now at certain areas there are like little gaps, especially at the ends of some of these cubes. I don't know if too many of them are very visible. There's one over here, like right next to Robinson Crusoe. The problem is that if I can't fit the next alphabetical one, then I just sort of leave it empty. And that means that I end up having several relatively large gaps throughout the shelves. Not too many, but it's enough to where I end up having to have a decent number of games on top of the shelves. Is it a big deal? Not really. And again, sort of the price to pay to make them look good and look a little bit more presentable and much easier to access. But that said, it's enough rambling from me. Again, I'm really excited to have redone my shelves. I hope that you guys appreciate it as a new sort of little background for me. But again, please give me your personal thoughts on it. What do you think about your own personal way that you store games? Why do you store them that way? Do you just put them in a closet? Do you really care? Do you have a huge collection and so it doesn't really matter too much? Let me know in the comments below. You guys know I love to hear from you. But with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.